So today I am lucky enough to be in the Apennine Mountains in central northern Italy, and I am currently stood in the Il Giogo Pass. And this pass here through the Apennine Mountains formed part of the notorious Gothic Line that was finally breached by the British and American forces in September 1944. Behind me is Monte Altuzzo, and it was here in the middle of September 1944 that the 1st Battalion of the 338th Infantry Regiment of the 85th Infantry Division that formed part of 2 Corps of the 5th Army would fight up these slopes, eventually capturing Monte Altuzzo on the 17th of September 1944 after a brutal 4-day struggle. So on the 10th of September 1944, 2nd Corps of the US 5th Army under General Mark Clark advanced across the Sierra River with the objective of reaching the Gothic Line. The Gothic Line being the line of German resistance that stretched from the western coast of Italy all the way to the east, and this was in reality the Germans' last major defensive or fixed defensive line in northern Italy. So the Germans, being the experts they were at defensive warfare, they knew that by constructing a defensive line across both coasts of Italy and using the Apennine Mountains, where I'm currently stood, would be a major obstacle for any Allied push north. Now, the Gothic Line started construction work in 1943 as the Germans realised that it would be a useful place to hold the Allies up, and using slave labour and from organisation Todt, they were able to start constructing bunkers, machine gun nests, anti-tank ditches, laying mines and barbed wire all across this mountainous region in order to hold the Allies up. Now, just to give you some facts about the Gothic Line itself, there were over 2,300 machine gun pits dug, nearly 500 anti-tank gun emplacements, miles and miles of anti-tank ditches and barbed wire strewn all across this area. And then combining that with the Apennine Mountains, where some of those peaks go up to 7,000 feet. And as you can see from the ground around me, this is by no means the soft underbelly of Europe, as was often quoted. The terrain here, just to give you an idea, is extremely steep, it's rocky, it's wooded, there's very few paths. I'm lucky that where I'm currently stood, there is a little bit of a path to access it, but back in 1944, this area would have just been hell from a soldier's point of view, but from a defensive point of view, it was ideal. Just every single area could be covered from a vantage point, plenty of places to lay ambushes and to have interlocking arcs of fire from machine guns, anti-tank guns, artillery fire. For the Germans, this was their ideal defensive positions. Originally, they were going to attack through the Footer Pass, which is further to the west, And again, it's another north-south draw that runs up through the Apennine Mountains. And they thought it was very weakly held by the Germans. However, what they didn't realise was the Germans identified that pass, and realising that it didn't create much of a natural barrier, ensured that that was one of the most heavily fortified positions in the whole of the Gothic Line. But fortunately for Second Corps, their G2, their intelligence, managed to pick up on this with help through the local Italian partisans, and they understood quite rapidly that the footer pass was not going to be an option. So their attack was then switched to here at the Il Giogo Pass. Now, the British 8th Army had already penetrated the Gothic Line and were heading north, so Second Corps' attack would be in support of the actions already carried out by the British 8th Army, because they'd already managed to push through the Gothic Line. Here at the Il Giogo Pass, the terrain is incredibly bad. Now, I've driven up here this morning, and to think that Second Corps thought they could push through here is absolutely crazy. The road coming up through the pass was very twisty turny, and I can't imagine how bad it would have been in 1944, especially toward the middle of September when the operation was conducted here. So it was understood by Second Corps that if they were to take the Il Giogo Pass and be able to move freely north through the Apennine Mountains at this location, that they would need to take the surrounding mountains of Monte Altuzzo and Monticelli, which overlook the Il Giogo Pass. Initially, the 91st Infantry Division was in the lead, and they managed to advance 2,000 yards from their jump-off positions toward the base of the two mountains. And on the 12th of September, the 91st was ordered to put the attack in, and the 85th Infantry Division would be in support of those guys. So with the 91st Division in the lead, the 85th Infantry Division of Second Corps was given the task on the 12th of September to take Monte Altuzzo and the surrounding lower hills that form part of that mountainous area. So Monte Altuzzo itself sits 926 meters above sea level and has a really impressive commanding view of this surrounding area. But below that itself, there are other hills, notably Hill 782, and then there's a big boomerang-shaped spur that runs east to west, coming off Altuzo itself. And it was here that the 12th Regiment of the 4th Fallschirmjäger Division, which formed part of the 1st Fallschirmjäger Corps attached to the German 14th Army here in Italy, were heavily dug in, and they were really prepared for the Americans to come this way. So just to give you an idea of who the 4th Fallschirmjäger Division were, now these were the men who had fought the Americans at the Anzio beachhead and held them up for a long time. A very experienced division. However, as the Allies kept pushing north on all fronts, like a lot of German units, their core of experienced fighters and their senior NCO cadre, which bore the brunt of the fighting, soon became depleted. And as replacements came in, a problem that the Allies suffered with as well, their replacements would just be too green. They would get killed straight away. They didn't have the experience nor the understanding of the world they were going into, and there wasn't time to teach them. So their forces just became so worn down. But by the time they had pulled back to here on the Gothic Line, they had well-established defensive positions, and this was ideal terrain for them with which to hold up the Americans. Now, interestingly, one mistake that the German forces did make when positioning forces along the Gothic Line, they naturally believed that the footer pass, being as open as it is, would be where the Americans would push through. They clearly employed their own doctrinal thinking into that rather than trying to look at it from the enemy perspective. So the bulk of their forces were held around the pass there. They'd never anticipated that the Americans would launch their major assault against the Il Giogo Pass, and had they have done so, it would have caused a lot more difficulties for the American Second Corps trying to push through this region. So on the 12th of September 1944, it was the men of 1st Battalion from the 338th Infantry Regiment of the 85th Infantry Division that would be tasked with moving from the positions down in the valley below up these slopes, ultimately trying to take Monte Altuzzo, which is off to my right over to the east. So for the rest of the day of the 12th, the time was spent with the officers and senior NCOs in reconnaissance, trying to work out the best route through the valley to the base of the hills in order to launch their attack up these slopes. Now, and I hope you can see from where I'm stood, the terrain here is exceptionally steep. Certainly, you wouldn't want to come up here without some proper climbing equipment if you're coming from the base, and to think they did it carrying heavy packs and rifles is an incredible feat. So Colonel Jackson, the commanding officer of 1st Battalion of the 338th Infantry Regiment, came up with a relatively simple plan. It would be A, B and C Company would lead the attack, with A Company going first and D Company providing 2 heavy machine gun platoons with the lead companies in support, as well as 6 mortars to provide fire support as required. And it was at 0600 on the morning of the 13th of September 1944 that A Company would start the advance towards the base of Hill 782. And Hill 782 is further over to that way, and you can see it on the maps. That would be their main advance because it was the most direct route all the way up to the peak of Monte Altuzzo where the Germans were located. Now, initially their advance went relatively smoothly. For a couple of hours they didn't come under any enemy fire. However, the men of the 12th Regiment of the 4th Fallschirmjäger were observing them the whole way. So by 0800, the men of A Company from 1st Battalion had advanced to the southwest slopes of Hill 782, and it was at this point that they came under fire from the machine guns of the German Fallschirmjägers dug in on the southwest slopes there. The Americans, though, managed to overcome this withering fire from the Germans, and they carried on their advance slowly but surely up the slopes of Hill 782. And by 1300, reports got to Colonel Jackson that the advance was moving forward. However, by the end of the day, Hill 782 was still very much in German hands, and 1st Battalion had suffered 23 casualties, unfortunately, as a result of the actions being fought there that day. Now, as A Company from the 1st Battalion of the 338th was putting the attack in up on Hill 782, 2nd Battalion was actually moving through the Il Giogo Pass itself. But throughout the whole of the 13th, along with other regiments from the 85th Infantry Division, none of them had managed to penetrate very far into the Gothic Line, and they were all being held up by the German defenders here. So moving out under the cover of darkness in the early hours of the 14th of September, Captain Peabody would lead his men from B Company to link up with the men of A Company on the southwest slope of Hill 782. Now, I can't imagine how difficult it was for Captain Peabody trying to do that in the dark, having not had a good night's sleep, not eaten properly, not showered, carrying loads of gear, rifle, with the pressure of trying to lead his men right under the noses of the Germans. Because I've walked around here during the day in 2022 with modern maps, with GPS, and all these slopes look very much the same. Trying to navigate around here isn't the easiest thing to do. But what happened was he saw Hill 872, which is that way, and believed it to be the location of where the 339th Infantry Regiment were on Monte Veruca, and that is further to the east. As a result, this confusion led him to believe that he needed to come back further west, and he ended up bringing his men up on to this hill here. And it was this hill which would later earn the nickname of Peabody's Peak. As B Company moved up here, the Germans dug into this location, soon saw the Americans approaching as it was now dawn, and they opened up. Now, it was unfortunate that as a result of this push up the hill, several of his men were injured and some were killed. However, through a bit of grit and determination, they kept putting in the attack despite the Germans' dogged defensive resistance here. Now, throughout the course of the day on the 14th, the Germans, knowing that they held the upper hand here on Peabody's Peak, put in counterattack after a counterattack against the American forces, each time keeping the Americans from advancing anywhere up the slope. Now, obviously, this did attrit the German forces. They were losing men as well as the Americans, but it was enough to keep B Company on this hill without going any further, not providing any support to A Company, who were also attacking on hill 782. So again, by the end of the day on the 14th, 2nd Corps and 1st Battalion from the 338th had not managed to advance anywhere near as far as was originally planned by Colonel Jackson. One thing though that did happen as a result of Captain Peabody's navigational mistake was that out of 170 men that came up the hill, 96 of them went down as casualties, with 24 of those being killed. As a result of their heavy losses suffered here on the western slope of the spur that leads down from Monte Altuzzo, B Company was basically withdrawn from the battle at that point because they were no longer combat effective. So by the end of the 14th, no progress had been made by the American 2nd Corps in taking the Giogo Pass, but it had come at a price for the Germans as well. They were getting whittled down, and combined with the artillery fire support from the Americans as well as air support, they were unable to bring up supplies and reinforcements to their forward positions, making it very difficult for the men that were here defending this area. One thing though that the 14th Army did realise was that now the Il Giogo Pass was the main thrust of the American attack into the Gothic Line, they would now send the 2nd Battalion of the Grenadier Lair Brigade to this area to reinforce the men of the Fallschirmjäger. However, this move couldn't be done straight away, and they were still a day or two away from making it to the positions where they were needed. So the morning of the 15th of September 1944 dawned with a new attack plan for 2nd Corps. They would, instead of launching one single attack, they would launch multiple attacks at different times, staggering their forces in order to try and confuse and disorientate the Germans and try and distract them from where the main assault would actually happen. So in the fight for Monte Altuzzo itself, C Company was now thrown into the attack to support A Company, given that B Company had been withdrawn after the navigation error by Captain Peabody and the brutal fighting that took place here on the western slope on the 14th of September. With C Company in support, A Company were then able to start moving up Hill 872, and they were able to keep pushing further forward toward the objective of capturing Monte Altuzzo itself. So now I'm probably about 400 or 500 meters away from the summit of Monte Altuzzo on the path that leads up to it. But here, the guys from the Gothic Line Museum just down the road from here, and you'll be able to find all the links to their website and their social media stuff in the comments below, so please do go check it out. But this here is the reconstructed Feld Lazaret, the field hospital, the first aid post. Started the reconstruction work in 2010, and they have done a phenomenal job, as you can see. Now, because it's September the 4th, as I'm filming this today, this is now closed up for the autumn and winter season. But you can see the work they've done on it. It's amazing. There's another entrance back down the track, just around the corner there. And it was here where the wounded from the 12th Fallschirmjäger Regiment that were fighting here would have been brought and treated by their Fallschirmjäger medic comrades till they could be evacuated further to the rear to a proper field hospital and taken care of. So walking along the spur from Peabody's Peak to the east toward Monte Altuzzo itself. And there's still signs of the German positions here. It's probably a bit hard to see on the camera, but here in this area just here is a German foxhole. And this is the perfect position because with these trees cleared out, what I'll do, I'll just get in the foxhole itself. From this position, although it's hard to imagine now with all the trees in the way, these would have been cut down to provide open arcs of fire for the Germans. But this looks out into the valley itself, and if you can see through the trees, although it's really hard on this particular camera, you can definitely tell that this would have been an ideal fighting location, right on the edge of the slope to deter any attacks being made up the front, but also to cover down into the bowl, into the valley down below. So I'm now walking up the eastern slope of the Boomerang Spur that runs down from Monte Altuzzo. So Monte Altuzzo itself is further up this path, and I can tell you something, that even with a good night's sleep, a nice comfortable bed, breakfast this morning, I'm wearing modern day hiking gear. I'm not getting shot at by the Germans. I'm not carrying a rifle, just this camera, and it's steep. I also as well like to think of myself as being relatively fit and being able to cope with climbing hills, but how the guys did it under difficult circumstances back in 1944, carrying that equipment. And this is both the Americans and the Germans as well. The train doesn't care about political ideologies or what language was spoken or what uniform was worn. The train was difficult for all of them, and that's certainly something that I think is key to remember when you look at fighting in these locations. So again, yeah, there's still more bunkers here that have been redug out, repurposed, all done by the team from the museum, and it definitely gives you a much better understanding of how the Germans created their defensive positions as well, but why they put them here. Now, unfortunately, as I said, with the first aid station, we can't go in them because of the time of year. But just by looking at it, you can get a really good idea of all the hard work and dedication that's gone into making these possible. But now, from this point, we're on the rearward slope, so this could well have been Fallschirmjäger, command bunker, command CP. I'm now going to go up to the top of Monte Altuzzo and finish off the story of the 1st Battalion, the 3rd Battalion of the 338th Infantry Regiment and their attack up here on the 17th of September 1944. Right, I am now on the top of Hill 926, and it is really apparent why the Americans were desperate to take this position. Overlooking that way behind me is the Il Giogo Pass, and you can clearly see the commanding view that the Fallschirmjäger troops had here. What's really interesting about the top of Hill 926 are all the German positions that are still left here. So if we follow this around, this was one of the original trenches dug by the Fallschirmjäger. It's one of their defensive fighting positions, and then it carries on further down, and there's more trenches down there which I'll have a look at in a moment. Right, so currently stood at the very southern edge of Monte Altuzzo on Hill 962, and this was a former German observation point, observation bunker, again restored by the museum, which you can find the details of in the comments below. But it was from here that the Germans had such a commanding view of the valley below, and you can just see, especially on a day like today, just how incredible that view is and what a difficult job the Americans must have had getting up this southern slope of Hill 962, trying to dislodge the Germans from this position. So in the fight for Monte Altuzzo, the men of A Company 1st Battalion of the 338th made slow progress against Hill 782, even with the support of the men from C Company of the 1st Battalion. However, with the 3rd Battalion from the 338th being thrown into the attack on the 17th of September, progress was then made up the smaller hills from Hill 782 all the way up here, up to Hill 926 or Monte Altuzzo proper, with small unit actions, with platoons and then down to squads making heroic advances up the hill in the face of withering resistance from the Germans. They were able to slowly and surely gain the ground they needed to make it up to this position. It was at this point that 1st Platoon from A Company was detached from the attacks coming up on the eastern side, up from Hill 782, and they actually went across the bowl and ended up on the Peabody Peak Ridge, and they moved up that way in order to split the German defenders and make a combined push upon both slopes. Along with 3rd Battalion, that was a very effective move, and it did enable them to make great moves up to the top here on Hill 926. So by the 18th of September, with determined effort from the Americans, not just here at Monte Altuzzo, but right across the Il Giogo Pass, they were actually able to force a gap 7 miles wide with which to start pushing north through the Gothic Line and continue the advance with an opening that was relatively secure for the movement of men and material further to the battlefront where it was needed. So the Germans by this point were now in full flight. The 14th Army was starting to withdraw its forces from here. They withdrew north to Firenzuola, and then from there they put up sporadic resistance, and then the retreat continued north into the Po Valley with the Americans and the British, as well as the rest of the Commonwealth and Empire forces hot on their heels. So whilst it's got to be said that the infantry fight that happened here by the men of the 1st and 3rd Battalion from the 338th Infantry Regiment, as well as the 2nd Battalion in the pass itself and the 339th Infantry Regiment further to the east. I mean, their fight was an incredible one. It was heroic, it was savage, and I have no idea how they got up these slopes wearing wool uniforms, carrying heavy wooden and metal rifles against a very, very well dug in, skilled and determined enemy. I just don't know how they managed it. But it has to be said that while all of that is, from a military point of view, very impressive, and from a sort of a feat of human endeavour, very impressive, what really won the battle here was the timed artillery and the air support. Why this was important was it was able to catch the Germans when they were moving out in the open. The German bunkers were ever so strong. They were really well constructed. You've seen that from the modern ones that have been remade. They really do look well made. But it was when they were out in the open that they were vulnerable. And this timed artillery fire prevented, a lot like we saw in France with things like the Falaise Gap and other battles that the Germans fought. They were fine when they were dug into their positions, but if they needed to move men and supplies forward, take casualties back, that was where Allied artillery and air support especially was just the dominating factor in everything that happened in the Allies' favour here. Without that, I don't know if the Americans, no matter how determined their infantry were, and clearly they were, I don't know if they'd have been able to have dislodged the Germans from this position. I mean, I'm currently stood in one of their trenches on the side of Hill 926 at the very top of Monte Altuzzo, and you can clearly see how deep it is into the rock and the dirt. And bearing in mind, this has probably been filled in somewhat, possibly over the years, because it's currently just below my waist now. I'm 6 foot, so likely the guys would have been much lower down in it, so this is probably filled up, and over the years the dirt has just built up again. But it's such a commanding position, and it's only really artillery that's going to dislodge you from this position. When you look at the gradient of the slopes coming up here, I mean, it's absolutely horrific. I don't know if you can see down there, but unless you've had special mountain warfare training, and you're an exceptionally fit and skilled soldier, there's no way you're getting up here if there's a determined and well-trained enemy at the top waiting for you. So the price paid by the Americans for capturing Hill 926 and enabling freedom of movement for 2nd Corps through the Il Giogo Pass came at a heavy one. Between the 1st and 3rd Battalions of the 338th Infantry Regiment, over 300 casualties were taken. However, this was viewed in the larger picture by 2nd Corps and 5th Army that these casualty figures were relatively light in terms of gaining access to this pass through the Gothic Line and being able to support the British in their advance along the eastern side of Italy. It also enabled then the rapid movement further north to the Po Valley, and then eventually ending in northern Italy with the finishing of the war in May 1945. Now, one thing we should all remember, and one thing that's really key to the fighting that took place in Italy, it doesn't receive the attention that Normandy, Market Garden and Bastogne does. In part because no TV series has been made about any unit that fought here, and hasn't received the attention that the likes of Easy Company 506 did, which is a real shame, because it comes across a lot of times, especially on social media, that it was only Eco 506 that won the war. Yet the men that fought here in Italy are largely forgotten. However, I hope this video does them justice, and we must remember that the fighting that was taking place here in 1944, or from 1943 actually, through to 1945, pinned down over 20 German divisions and enabled those guys in Northwest Europe to make the advances that they did from Normandy through into the Netherlands, through into Belgium, and then into Germany proper. So please, spare a moment for the guys that fought here. The conditions really were absolutely brutal, and probably the most brutal that were found in Europe outside of the Ardennes winter in 1944-45. So please, when you watch this, think about those men, think about what they went through, and just try and remember that the Italian campaign was no less important than what happened on the beaches of D-Day on the 6th of June. Right, so I hope you've enjoyed this episode of World War II Wayfinder. If you found it interesting, I would love it if you would just tap that subscribe button. Really means a lot to me, and I want to be able to share more stories with you. I've got more coming up from Italy, so please stay with me, and I will see you all in the next one.